Senator Budd, you're recognized for your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing, and thank the panel. This is truly fascinating. You know, public reporting around the Salt Typhoon hack, it's deeply concerning and speaks to the massive scale of Chinese efforts to infiltrate America's telecommunications infrastructure. Today's testimony referenced the mismatch between the scope of the threat and the ability to harden networks, incredibly deter malign state actors like China from trying again. China's heavy subsidies and commercial espionage for Huawei and ZTE have helped make them global leaders in deployed networks. I'm pleased to see that the National Defense Authorization Act, which my colleague mentioned just a moment ago, that included funding to finally complete the rip and replace of this compromised technology in the U.S. networks. So, Dr. Mulvanen, what else could the U.S. be doing to combat the global dominance of Chinese hardware providers?
So the thing is we discussed Open RAN earlier. There's a number of interesting dynamics, particularly in 5G, when we decided to adopt a plurilateral strategy where we decided to work with our OECD allies in Europe and Japan and South Korea. We confronted a number of dilemmas. One is that even if we don't buy Huawei equipment, that because of the Huawei's involvement in the standard setting for 5G, that they actually get 40% of the royalties for the patents from 5G. So even non-Huawei companies that sell 5G equipment, Huawei is still financially benefiting under the 3GPP standard setting process. Open RAN gave us an opportunity to get out of that trap and in fact be the basis for cooperation among OECD partners in an open source way that would not get bogged down in particular royalties and particular patents. It was also important in that case to break down any antitrust barriers that might exist between, for instance, Nokia and Ericsson in Europe and Juniper and Cisco in the United States that would prevent them from working together to actually build a coherent end-to-end handset to base station to servers offering of an alternative to 5G as an alternative to Huawei and ZTE for the Global South, for Africa, for South America, for Southeast Asia. Because for a long time, there was no Western company that actually offered an end-to-end offering that could compete with Huawei's. And so the things that we were doing in Open RAN and the things we were doing in those plurilateral frameworks, I think, strengthened our ability to not only push back against Huawei's global dominance, which had national security implications, but it also allowed us to strengthen our own companies to be able to compete on a relatively level playing field.
You know, 5G has been talked about for years. I mean, from here to the dinner table, but we're only recently hearing, at least in these settings, about Open RAN. Why the disconnect there?
Well, I mean, the carriers were right for a number of years that Open RAN wasn't as robust to be able to handle tier 1 level traffic as the current standards were. But that's why we invested so much money in Open RAN, was to help it catch up so that in fact the carriers wouldn't resist it by saying it's actually going to reduce our performance in terms of providing telecommunication service. So Open RAN had a lot of work to do, but I would argue, and agreeing with Dr. Lewis, that in fact Open RAN is much more mature and robust right now and is a credible alternative for the carriers. There's a lot of benefits to going to open source, by the way, as opposed to a closed source patent and royalty environment in which clearly Huawei is financially benefiting.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan, I wanted to briefly ask you, you mentioned that it's difficult for smaller providers to navigate these complex cybersecurity requirements from all these different agencies that sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't align with each other. Should this committee look at addressing streamlined cybersecurity requirements, and how could we encourage private sector investment in cybersecurity?
Yes, sir. That certainly would help by having some coordinated response and making sure that you are taking information collection regulations requirements that are already in place and using those as much to build on them into the cyber instead of creating new frameworks that make it even more challenging for smaller operators in particular to navigate.